Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are continuing our coverage of Spawn, and in this video, we're getting into the origin of Angela. Now, technically speaking, this doesn't happen in this order in terms of continuity. It actually comes later on as part of the Curse of Spawn storylines, and the Curse of Spawn was basically a kind of side-along series. You know, what we mentioned in the last video, it was a companion series that gave us like the origins and stories of various characters who were out there. I would say Angela is probably the most popular of the supporting characters, and a lot of you guys who are unfamiliar with Spawn but are familiar with Marvel are probably looking at this and saying, I thought Angela was a Marvel character, and she is now, but it wasn't always that way. Back with Spawn issues 9, 10, and 11, Todd McFarlane had basically contracted out to Neil Gaiman, Dave Sim, and Frank Miller, and then I actually had Alan Moore write a story as well. But basically they were contracted out to write these one-shots for the Spawn comic. And the reason why was really just to draw names, you know, to draw attention, you know, readership to it, in the sense that Image was already really popular at the time, and so was Spawn. Spawn was huge, but in order to kind of keep that momentum going, it behooved Todd McFarlane to like have an issue that just has like a big name. And Frank Miller had been a big name for quite some time, especially right after his run on Daredevil and going into The Dark Knight Returns, right? I mean, the guy had like set the world on fire with his Daredevil run, so it only made sense that after The Dark Knight Returns, he was like a huge name, right? So to have him attached to a Spawn story would draw a lot of eyes to it. The thing that makes this interesting is that Neil Gaiman had introduced a couple of different characters in addition to Angela in issue number 9, right? In Spawn issue number 9. But this was kind of a point of contestation between Todd McFarlane and Neil Gaiman, insofar as when Image, you know, in terms of their policy, it was the idea that if you create a character, you own the character, right? That was their big beef with Marvel, right? It was the idea that like, if you create a character for Marvel, then like it belongs to Marvel now. Whereas if you create a character at Image, it's wholly yours. You know, whether you can market it or not is totally up to you, but they're just a publishing house, right? It's your work, it's your thing. You don't have to worry about selling off the rights to anybody. Angela proved to be exceedingly popular. And so what this did is it led to a legal dispute that was settled in 2002 and then finalized in 2012. And the way this played out is that with Angela being as popular as she was, and then Neil Gaiman coming along with the idea that I created the character, even though technically according to McFarlane, he argued that Neil Gaiman was basically contracted to create a character or to write a story, meaning that the character that was created, Angela, was owned by McFarlane and not by Neil Gaiman, because it was created for Todd McFarlane's title. This ended up kind of a pretty lengthy lawsuit that spanned, you know, a pretty good amount of time. In 2002, it was kind of settled in the sense that like they both co-owned the characters that Neil Gaiman had created. And then in 2012, Neil Gaiman got total ownership of Angela. This coincided with the desire of Joe Quesada and them at Marvel to bring Angela over to Marvel Comics, probably one of the most squandered opportunities in the history of comic books. The result was that in 2013, Angela was basically purchased directly by Marvel from Neil Gaiman and then brought in through Age of Ultron, and they never did anything with her, right? They made her like Angela Queen of Hell and then just wasted her after that. She was on like, I think most recently she was on like As Guardians of the Galaxy. Angela needs her own solo book. She's interesting enough, right? She's super cool. But this is the original origin for Angela in the Spawn comics, right? So the way this plays out, we're kind of yanking this out of an existing story. There is kind of a story that's going on at the moment, but it's not really relevant to what's going on with their character. It will be later on. For those of you guys who recognize the face of this guy, the man with the glasses, please do not spoil anything. Please do not tell people. I know it's a pointless endeavor to ask that, but please don't tell people. But in any event, basically this picks up with a woman essentially just like fleeing for her life with her baby in the era of like proto-men, 100,000 years ago. Now that number 100,000 is pretty important, but basically it's 100,000 years ago that this all takes place. And this woman's basically fleeing for her life from bandits and all kinds of crazy guys. And then in the midst of it all, she kind of sees this face looking at her from a rock, and then is sort of overcome with like this rage, right? And ultimately ends up killing all these guys. Well, then following that, she takes the baby, ends up putting it in a tree, when you have these wildcats more or less that start like consuming the corpses of these men. But fearing for the death of her and her child, she puts the baby in a tree and then ultimately ends up just kind of sacrificing her life to ensure her baby's survival, right? And in the moments when this happens, a kind of angel comes down, a seraphim comes down, and then basically rescues the baby, right? But this woman sacrifices her life to save the life of her child. Following that, you jump directly to Egypt. And what you have is this woman who's basically being made to work with slave labor. And where you end up having, you know, the last of her sons who's basically killed. His muscles give out. He hasn't really eaten or drank anything. And he's crushed by one of the rocks. She really kind of goes to grieve to him. And then in turn is whipped to the point where she almost dies. Following that, they take her, they whip her even further. Then they string her up and leave her to die. And then again, you know, she really just kind of greets her son, you know, as an angel that comes down and tells her the life you're going to get after this kind of life ever after is infinitely better than anything you're experiencing here. But yet again, this specter of death shows up. And so from there, you jump to a young girl, and we're not really given a time frame. We're just told it's during the era after slavery. If I were a betting man, I would say this is probably during the Rosewood Massacre. If you guys aren't familiar with that, you should look it up. The Rosewood Massacre is a really important moment in American, Southern, and Black history. But basically, this young girl is kind of fleeing for her life after her parents were killed, right? In what's called the Forest of Dead Bodies. Insofar as there was a point whereby all these bodies were strung up from trees, and literally when you went through there, it was just all these bodies hanging. And the result is that she again sees the specter of this guy and just kind of runs as fast as she can to get away as best she can. She ends up stumbling across the young boy that she spent time with named Jeremiah, who of course was hung as well. But as she's fleeing, she ends up tripping over this branch and ends up going, falling down this hillside and into the water where she doesn't really have the ability to swim, and begins to drown and then pleads for help. One of the clansmen sees her and then shoots her, and that's the end of her. But she's greeted by the angelic appearances, more or less, of her mother and her father, who really just kind of whisk her away to heaven. And so following that, you travel to Auschwitz. And I hope you guys are kind of noticing a pattern here. It's this pattern of basically people dying, but experiencing the process of traveling to heaven. For this one particular woman, her children are also being sent to the gas chambers. And so as a result of this, she basically, pleads to their children to just run as best they can. And the reality is they were probably going to die, but in a situation as desperate as that, to just flee and have the chance of escaping is better than just like going to the gas chambers, right? And, any chance for hope, any chance for survival for her children is better than none at all. And so of course, with her children basically being mowed down, she in turn is taken back into the line, and she kind of proceeds forward accordingly, and then ultimately ends up perishing in the gas chambers. But that's how this process is, over and over and over again. And so the final person that we get is basically this very, very old woman who's essentially dying of cancer, and her life is for the most part completely gone to pieces. Her husband has essentially abandoned her. He was struggling with alcoholism. The youngest of her sons basically died of AIDS. Her two daughters are living out in the world somewhere and don't care how she's doing. Her oldest son has basically been consumed by alcoholism as well. There's really nothing left in her life. It's just her with nothing to really live for. And so seeing this specter of death, she basically ends up, kind of giving up and ultimately ends up perishing. But what matters here is that these 5 individuals who have basically died by tragic means, but who were greeted with life everlasting following their death, all sort of coalesce and come together in the form of Angela. Now the question is, why? And this comes by way of a woman named Catherine. What we end up doing is traveling to a place called Elysium. And when Angela is more or less born, or when she's kind of coalesced into the being that she is now from these 5 spirits, that following this birthing process, Catherine begins to sort of give her a tour of this area, showing her what's around here, showing her what Elysium is, and basically says that we are essentially angels, is more or less what she says, right? We're angels, we're more or less soldiers, and we are kind of the antithesis of the Hellspawns. That Malboja has this massive army of individuals that he's creating, and he has these Hellspawns that get created every so often. They're designed to kind of lead his army of the dead. By whatever manner and whatever means, our job is to kill them and to ensure that leadership role is never undertaken. And what they have is what's called a hall of trophies. Basically, all the different Hellspawns over the however long this war's been going on that they've killed, right? Successfully managed to eliminate. And it's kind of a cool thing, right? Because what this does is it expands on the notion of good and evil, right? Because when you kind of look at the Spawn mythos, it's just like Al Simmons running around killing people who do bad things and that's it. But this really sort of expanded the landscape in a huge way. Now, by the time this Curse of the Hellspawn story had come out, the landscape had been expanded by a pretty good chunk, right? It just didn't really involve Angela. It did, but you didn't really know her character, her origin, or anything along those lines. But what happens is Angela is basically taken to this door that stands 1,000 feet tall, and when she enters, she encounters God. And what God does is basically start taking her through and essentially saying, when Angela asks, like, is this heaven? God says, no, it's just kind of a place where I walk around and just sort of do my own thing and gather my thoughts and so on. But what God does is basically say, you were created by these 5 individual souls who would sacrifice their lives for the people that they love. And what this meant was that you are by definition a being composed of goodness. And that's why you exist the way you do, because if you were being composed of evil, you would succumb to the power of Malboja. Now in the Spawn universe, when it comes to like good guys and bad guys, it gets pretty blurry. So she's a good guy insofar as like good and evil are defined in the Spawn universe. But essentially it's this notion of your job is to go out there and to basically fight off these various members of the Hellspawn, right? But you can never stop. You can never give ground. That evil is a force that's always encroaching. It's always trying to drag you down. It's always trying to convince you that you can't win. But you have to keep on fighting, because if you don't, then yes, you will lose, right? So it is a constant struggle and it is a constant battle, but it's one of these battles that more or less has to always be fought. And so it's kind of a cool moment, because following this, what you end up getting is Angela basically engaging in this kind of combat of sorts with Catherine, kind of train her, get her prepared for what it means to be a soldier of heaven. And you get this kind of cool moment because what they end up doing, you know, in kind of this thing, you know, Catherine says, well, I want to show you something before we, you know, depart, before you're officially inducted into our guild, for lack of a better word, you know, and she says, this is a very, very old Hellspawn, right? This guy is exceedingly powerful. And Angela's kind of taken aback. She's kind of surprised by how capable and how massive this force is. And she's kind of like, you know, who in the world took this guy out? Was it you? And the response of Catherine was, no, it was you 100,000 years ago, right? Like a long, long time ago. And where Angela looks at this and says, well, that doesn't make any sense. I've just now been created. How could this have possibly been done so long ago? That's where we sort of get this explanation of how it is that Angela can be 100,000 years old, yet have been created after the events of like World War II. That when it comes to Elysium, it spreads all across time and space. You can go to any point in time, in any space you want to within the universe from Elysium. And so the idea is following her creation, she sent 100,000 years ago to go on a mission to kind of just eliminate people, to basically take out these various Hellspawns that are out there. And so following this process of basically being inducted into the angelic soldiers, these angelic warriors, what Angela is given are two things. The first are the angelic ribbons, and the second is the dimensional lance. The angelic ribbon is similar to like Spawn's K7 Letha, which is the suit that he wears, which grants him the ability to kind of extend his suit out to, you know, create weapons or stabbing objects and different things like that. But it's an extension of himself that kind of helps to bolster his abilities in combat and can just outright like heal him and even operate of its own accord, right? If Spawn is knocked unconscious, it'll continue to protect him, things along those lines. The ribbons aren't really exactly like the K7 Letha. They do offer some measure of support in the sense that they can keep Angela warm, or they can kind of be an extension of combat. They're not indestructible, but they can help her in combat. But the dimensional lance is really the important object, the one thing that really allows Angela to defeat Hellspawns. Now, the form and function of the dimensional lance is actually explained in the first appearance of Angela in Spawn issue number 9, and we'll cover it here, but we'll also cover it again once we get to that. But Angela really kind of run overs the various weapons that are available to warriors of heaven who track down these Hellspawns and face off against them. And because of the fact that things like the K7 Letha are so capable, that what they end up having to do is use the dimensional lance in order to get into close proximity to a Hellspawn and then send it away from this dimension, leaving only its carapace behind, or its suit, basically the K7 Letha behind, which can actually be captured by Angela, and in turn, you know, once it's terminated, use it as a trophy and take it back. And that's how things have always kind of been done, right? That's how things have always just sort of been handled when it comes to the various warriors of heaven. The funny thing is that when Angela encounters Spawn for the first time, things are going to go radically different. Well, they will, but they won't. They will not go in the way that Angela expects. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. This is the origin of Angela. She's officially inducted into the ranks of the Warriors of Heaven and goes forward to become a killer of Hellspawns until she meets Al Simmons. And then everything changes. But we're going to bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. I want to say thank you to all of the new patrons who have joined patreon.com/comicsexplained. I want to give a shout out to Henry, Young Typhon, Elias G, David JS, Jacob H, Ben, John H, Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, James O, Chris T, Matt N, Jeff R, Joey M, Steven Z, Sloth Like Lou, David C, John H, Lean and Mean. That guy asks questions all the time. Adam K, Genosis 916. I want to say thank you to all of you all. This list is growing all the time. Thank you for joining the Patreon.